welcome, fellow EdPaloozers. My name is Jason Swanson. I serve as the Director for Strategic Foresight at the KnowledgeWorks Foundation. And for the next 55 minutes or so, we're going to be working together to think about futures of learning in a post-pandemic world and make some connections to how policy can really help to enable those futures. So getting started. As I mentioned, I'm from KnowledgeWorks. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are a national nonprofit. We're headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we work all throughout the United States. Really, our mission is to enable meaningful personalized learning at scale so that every student can really participate and enjoy student-centered, highly personalized learning. I join you in the capacity as a member of our strategic foresight team. So one of the things that makes KnowledgeWorks fairly unique is since 2006, we have been rigorously exploring futures for learning. We typically look at least 10 years out into the future. And as part of that work, we author freely available forecasts, sense-making guides, do sense-making work such as today's session, and then do more experimental exploratory work. So things like experiential futures, youth podcasting around the future of learning, and generally look for creative vehicles to tell stories about how the future of learning might be different than the present. So the frame for today's conversation is to really use the future as a way to consider new and innovative ways to meet learners' needs in the present, while at the same time really acting to sow the seeds for a longer-term horizon for the future of learning. And to really get this started, I wanted to start to stretch our thinking a little bit and to use the chat box and to answer this question. So if we were to go out to the future, it's the year 2040, we're going to go 20 years out. What might a common thing be? And this could be an item, this could be a service for students, this could be a classroom practice, it could be a school structure, you name it, don't limit yourself. But what might that common thing be in 2040 that's found in schools that is not present right now? I'm going to spend a couple minutes on this again. Just input your answer into the chat box. Textbooks, so they won't be present, or they would be present in 2040. Personally, I think we'll see really new types of roles that are not present in 2020. Things like directors of relationships, community facilitators, folks that are tasked with building substantive partnerships throughout the community. So as you think of more ideas, feel free to keep putting those in the chat box. But I want to continue to move on. We have a very small amount of time for the session. So quick note about futures thinking and really the frame for which I want to approach this conversation. So foresight, futures thinking, strategic foresight, all the big sort of umbrella terms for thinking about the future really have nothing to do with predicting the future. So one of the things we like to talk about is that we are in the business of depiction rather than prediction. So it's it's not possible to predict the long-term future, right? However, it is entirely possible to really think through a wide range of futures that we could depict it both effectively using tried and true methods. So what you see on screen here, it's something we call the cone of plausibility. It is not a foresight method, it's a foresight teaching tool. And it really backs this idea that we're here to depict things, not to predict things. And that the future is really many, and it's not one, right? So what you see here is really, it's called the cone of plausibility. It shows within our limits of plausibility where all these futures could rest. And one of the ways I like to break this down is that white on the screen those are futures, those are possible futures, right? Like anything could happen. Like I could win the lottery, it's possible, but it's not plausible. So plausibility really happens when we begin to start to track trends and make certain assumptions based on evidence of change. So that gets us to our second P in future studies. So that would be plausible futures, right? So these are things that maybe they could happen, whereas the possible futures are like they might happen, right? Our third future, our third P in this, it's my favorite future. Those are preferred futures, or these are also visions, right? So in depicting a range of futures, there's often elements of a future that we find more desirable, that we want to begin to work towards. Another way to think about this is to frame it in terms of change. We're thinking and making assumptions about change and their long-range effects. Change comes in two flavors. The first flavor is inbound change. It's the change that happens to us. It's change that we're making assumptions about. Will it speed up? Will it slow down? Will it reverse? Will it stop? The other change that we're talking about here is outbound change. So inbound change is the change that happens to me. Outbound change is the change that I am putting out into the world. It's how I handle the inbound change that's coming to me. If we think about the role policy can play in shaping the future, that is a form of outbound change. Inbound change is about assumption. Outbound change is really an articulation of our values. So when we're talking about things that might be common in 2040, things like personalized learning, virtual options, all of those might be forms of outbound change, change that we're seeking to create as we deal with lots and lots of inbound change. Now, COVID-19, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, really have created a situation where in our near-term future, we're dealing with massive amounts of uncertainty. So more so than we're typically used to. So this type of thinking and these type of tools are made to cut through uncertainty and actually see uncertainty as a feature rather than a bug. So I want to approach our conversation again with this idea that we're going to depict a range of futures, right? But inside of these futures, our current actions have great sway. Remember, it's that outbound change piece over what the future looks like. And as we think about the massive amounts of uncertainty and the disruption that the twin pandemics have had in learning, this slide really articulates a great way of thinking through our longstanding efforts, our current efforts to meet student needs, and our more visionary efforts at where we want to go. And really, if we think about this transition point, really is where we're at now dealing with COVID as we're starting to think about a vaccine and kind of ebbing towards that post-pandemic future. One of the things we want to be thinking about are all our efforts, both past and present, and the degree of strategic fit with where we want to go. So if we think about everything that we've had to ramp down once COVID started, right? Standardized testing and the rash of waivers that happened, for instance, the things that had to ramp up, Alexis, more virtual options, right? That might continue to ramp up into the future. And then these elements of a preferred future. And when we begin to scrutinize these things with what's going to ramp down in the near to midterm future, and what do we actually want to keep around, right? In that way of kind of scrutinizing this is the way I like to think about it is of what seeds have we planted that we need to tend to really develop into this broader vision of the future. But to get to that, I think we need to kind of put some frames up around what that third P, that preferred future, what that vision might actually be. So again, using that chat box, I want to really get down to the meat of this and ask you, what do you want for the future of learning? When we think about that big P, what we would channel all our efforts into in terms of outbound change, what is your preferred future? And I'm going to ask you to describe that preferred future using really bold adjectives. Can we get away from sort of transactional language, right? Of just, students will have, more, they'll be ready for the future, right? That's a vision. It's also kind of an outcome. But might it be joyful? Might it be equitable? Might it be built upon the foundations of justice? Might students have voice, choice, and agency? Might it be personalized, etc.? So start filling up that chat box. This is going to begin to act as our North Star for the rest of our time together. Relevance. Melissa, I see you. Absolutely. Also, think about the feelings of being a student in this visionary future. What might it be like? So a lot of times when we think of the future, it's whiz bang, right? But there's also elements of the mundane. We know it to be true as we grow up. Successful for all, useful. What's that student experience like? Is it exciting? Is it insightful? I use the word joyful a lot for this. I had one gentleman in a workshop say that they wanted to describe the future of learning as being sexy, and I thought that was brilliant. Melissa, that's great. Less confined to the school building, calendar schedule, so less time-bound, less place-specific. And I think we've seen the seeds of that happen in this past school year. Stay with this question for one more minute. If you have a burning desire to get something off your chest here, elements of a visionary future. All right, so keeping this chat box in mind, all of those adjectives we use to describe this preferred future, and they're all terrific elements, right? This would be a future I would want to live in. This would be a future I would want to raise kids in. This, I always call it the jealousy test, right? So if this school experience makes me feel jealousy in some way, then we know we're on the right track. But it's one thing to describe it in broad brush terms. So we want to put up some more boundaries to this. So we're going to be going into breakout rooms to really do an exercise that we call imagining preferred futures. We're going to kind of randomly assign groups, but the first task that you're going to have is to select a note taker, to select a spokesperson, because we're going to have to do a little bit of sharing out to bring this to a close. And we're going to answer a few questions. The first is to process the responses. So based on everything you just read, just what are you observing? What are the commonalities? And then let's reflect a little bit on the qualities of this ideal future. Specifically, what might it look and feel like to prioritize the kinds of learning we've been exploring? So taking Melissa's comment, if we were to assume the role of the student or the learner, what might it look like to have a school experience that is less confined to a school building, to a calendar, to a schedule? And then lastly, we want to create a breakthrough change headline. So what type of breakthrough change would have to have occurred to enable this type of future? Now, this could be a bill that was passed, so it could be policy conditions, it could be a school enabling a radically different schedule, it could be, and again, I'm riffing on Melissa, your ideas, it could be new forms of partnerships throughout the community that just didn't exist. So with that said, I'm going to attempt to drop you into breakout rooms. We're going to spend 15-ish minutes here, and then we're going to come back together and do some processing. So, all right, welcome back to the main room. I hopped in a couple of rooms, wasn't sure if you were all able to connect. I hope you were, but I wanted to do a little bit of processing and sharing out, right? So if you were able to connect with your fellow small group participants, what were some key qualities of an aspirational future that your group came up with? And they might have been the similar elements that we saw in the chat box. Could be something completely different. And then more specifically, what types of breakthrough change did your group imagine to really start to get to that future? And we can use the chat box to share out. My preference would be to do it live if that's possible. But I'm just curious to know what, if anything, came to the fore. And going further, if you weren't able to connect, what kind of breakthrough change might you imagine based on the qualities that you spoke about earlier in the chat box? Oh, Olivia, that's awesome. So administration that's more future focused and less policy focused. I would love to hear more about that. So what might a future focused like admin look like in this future? So Scott, that's interesting. So something to really look at, things like new measures of engagement. What are you retaining? So I'm going to say like better measures that are maybe more persistent. And then Melissa, I would say that is fairly, that would be a huge breakthrough to do that at scale and to have high quality blended learning where students could opt in and out. I see that as being a radical departure, right? To be able to do that and to do that really well, and not simply because we had to because of a crisis. And when we started to talk about that frame of sowing the seeds for that visionary future, I think your comment is dead on for that. That could be really interesting. So even an entirely different structure for thinking about small groups versus larger groups. So I want to continue this line of thinking, right? So we've thought about visionary futures. We thought about breakthrough change. There's some really awesome stuff here. But if we were to keep going further, right? The two big questions here, and Melissa, I'm going to use you as a terrific example for this in terms of asking how might we extend or adapt existing efforts to move towards that visionary future? So what else is going on that we need to continue doing, right? Because, the future, like it has to be kind of mundane. There's also going to be a mix of what we're doing now that works well. It won't be everything new. And I think this idea of continuing asynchronous blended learning is great. Scott, that increase in terms of catching up and getting better data about our students are all great. These are things that we should start or continue. So when you think about your own learning communities and your own work, rather than thinking through like this massive breakthrough change, what might you want to see continued that was just implemented in this last year? And then taking that a step further, right? So if we're like, what are we going to continue? What other broad strategies or approaches could help us move towards our own ideal futures? How might policy help, right? And this is where we get into terrain that is new and is often uncomfortable. And that if we're thinking about a radically different system of learning that's more in accordance with the values that you all surfaced in the beginning of the session, what types of roles, offerings, services, partnerships that don't exist would be needed? So it's a two-parter. One, what are you already doing that should be continued? And let's spend some time on this. And again, the asynchronous learning, the blended classroom is a great example, right? I think that a lot of the movement around competency-based learning as that scales up might be an amazing tool to begin to extend and adapt on a way to getting towards a learner-centered future, right? That we highlighted at the start. But what's happening in your own neighborhood and your own learning communities that are acting to sow those seeds, right? Those visionary seeds that we might have to tend, right? And again, the offer, if you want to speak in real time, raise your hand. We're happy to have you go live. Hi, Melissa.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. How are you?
Great, I'm well. So with these questions, what comes to mind is just, how if to rethink the future of learning, bringing forward, like I mentioned before, like, teachers have gotten used to asynchronous and synchronous learning. But it feels like we'd almost want to enlarge our teaching force to enable even more flexible groupings of kids, such that we could be bring together small groups for certain focused instruction or interventions or extensions while enabling, kind of some, and I'm not suggesting ability grouping, but I am suggesting that more opportunities for kids to work together on either an interest area or an area where teachers can provide that focused intervention. So I'm almost imagining like, you have a cohort of students, but you might have a few teachers associated with that cohort, such that they can be broken down, redistributed kind of across the day, across, both in-person and remote learning opportunities to much more easily differentiate and personalize learning, and really integrate more of some online learning platforms as well. But it just seems that we're starting to see some of the possibilities now, but it does feel like we would have to have some policy changes in terms of and funding increases to enable kind of more of that personalized attention.
I like that. So that speaks to what I would see as almost an increased, I kind of want to say radical degree of flexibility, but we'll say increased because radical might be a scary word in this context. But yeah, certainly I think policy can play a key lever to this. So I'm a futurist, not a policy wonk by any means, but that's where I see a lot of hope right now in sort of the emerging interest around unbraiding seat time and funding in certain states, the movement towards things like competency-based learning. So we're not really tying into seat time in the way that we're used to. But I think that gets it. If you can nail that, it starts to open up the doors in very real ways for what you've outlined. Yeah, how to integrate apprenticeships into secondary would be terrific as well. So yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting way of framing both kind of current efforts and then what new might have to be tacked onto it, right? And I think that the outcome of that would get us to a very different future of learning in ways that maybe would look familiar in some ways, but I think that grouping, not grouping, we'll call it this sort of flexible, almost learning pods, would be very, very interesting. And in a lot of ways mirror what our current and future work environments might look like. Anybody else care to share, or actually anybody else have any questions? So this type of thinking can be hard. It's exhausting for sure. Where we're certainly tasked with pushing beyond the boundaries of what we're used to and what we know. And certainly speculative thinking, when it relates back to our kids, can also feel fairly uncomfortable, right? But I think that there's an urgent need to develop sort of this muscle for thinking boldly about the future, and certainly beginning to pick apart what we want from it. So these types of conversations, to me, are vital, especially when we start to include a lot of our community members, and especially so our students, asking about what they want for the future. We have to have a transformational mindset, right? And I think that becomes critically important when we're faced with disruption. So the disruptions we felt all throughout 2020 should be an invitation to really begin to interrogate those visions that our learning communities hold about how our systems of learning could operate, should operate, how we would like them to operate, and what the very purpose of this thing that we call K-12 education is for. And, these disruptions throughout the entire year have really led to some deep tensions that, again, thinking boldly, thinking aspirationally, and taking a longer term time horizon can really begin to illuminate. We're so head down right now trying to meet the needs of learners during a crisis as we should be, that those looming tensions, that are on the horizon, that are almost acting as blind spots, we're going to have to address them one way or the other. And from my perspective, to have a very, very clear picture about where you want to go that holds up to the scrutiny of disruption should make those choices about how we enact certain policies, where we spend our resources. I'm not going to say easier, because none of these choices are ever easy, but they should illuminate at least a path, if not a clear path, in terms of taking those actions. And yeah, Melissa, it's hard to imagine something different from what we've experienced. And I think that's the crux of education, right? We're all users. So we all bring our biases and our experiences into our conceptualization of the future, right? And this happens in all aspects of our lives, right? We're colored by the past, or the past is prologue to a certain extent, or we fall into the trap of just merely extending the present, right? The times are good, they're going to continue to be good. Times are bad, they'll continue to be bad. And we're making a lot of assumptions about what a post-pandemic future might hold. So one of those key assumptions that we've heard a lot about is that we're expecting a certain level of financial austerity. And that might be true. However, it's an assumption, and I think it behooves us to think about counter assumptions too, because what if it's not, right? The assumption about will asynchronous and blended learning continue to be a viable path forward? I think that's a very strong assumption. There might be counters to that, where kids just want to see each other and nobody wants to sit in front of a laptop again. So you had a wonder here, how do we create opportunities to change our thinking? So certainly things like this, discussions like this, I would say that I would double down in terms of making these as inclusive as possible and bringing as many different perspectives into the fore as you can. Every time I talk to folks like yourselves, it expands my own notion of what's possible, and it helps check my own biases. We've got a lot of tools that we've published over this past year on the KnowledgeWorks blog. It's a series we call Futures Thinking Now that has methods for doing this. It's methods that we use in our own forecasting work. Certainly, we've written a lot about this, so you can beg, borrow, or steal any of that. But it's, we're always looking for novel thinking in this area that might illuminate in some ways different future possibilities, might provide a map of the terrain. But certainly there's a time cost for this. And this is a moment in time where it's a very scarce resource. So those are a couple of tips that I'm happy to give. We do a lot of workshops for folks around things like this that are rooted in the future, but this is certainly something you and your colleagues could do. One of the other recommendations I have is maybe to start a small study group within your learning community or your organization, just to make time to talk about the future. Could be something you've heard, something you've seen. Hey, have we thought about this? A lot of our work centers around changes that happen outside of education. So we found that most of our stakeholders have a pretty intuitive grasp about changes that are happening inside of education. But when we start to talk about things like accelerating technology, social change, social movement, trends in the environment, in the economic sectors, like, people just don't have time, right? So starting just with that. So what are the forces of change that are happening outside of where we currently live? So we've got 3 minutes left. If there's any other questions, burning questions, I'd be happy to get to those. And I want to thank everybody for their time. I know that this is a very non-traditional session. I call it Workshop Light. And I want to thank everybody for hanging in there. And should you have any questions about any of this, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk about the future, always happy to hear what you have going on, and to hear about your perspectives. So I'm going to hang out for a couple minutes, happy to answer any questions, and generally just thank everybody for being here.